have space here in the States with aging parents and nieces and nephews that are growing up, and I'd
Hmm.
love to be a part of their lives, and I'd also love to be able to share a lot of my wisdom that I've learned, this sort of cross-cultural empathic understanding. That there is so much that ties us together, and if we're able to identify some of those universals and to approach others with that empathic sensitivity, we really can create a much stronger, more incorporated, beautiful world.
Welcome to the Winging It Travel podcast with me, James Hammond. Every Monday, I'll be joined by guests to talk about their travel stories, travel tips, backpacking advice, and so much more. Right now, I'm taking the podcast on the road travelling with me. So tune in every week for short form episodes detailing all my travels alongside my Monday guest episode. Are you a backpacker, gap year student, or simply someone who loves to travel? Then this is the podcast for you, designed to inspire you to travel. There'll be stories to tell, tips to share, and experiences to inspire. Welcome to the show. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm joined by Joel David Bond, who has spent 2 decades travelling and working around the world. Joel is passionate about spreading the message of compassion, empathy, and understanding across borders. Today we're going to talk about Joel's time in Kurdistan in Iraq, his unique situation quarantined on a Greek island, his flight attendant background, as well as other passionate travels he has embarked on. Joel, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me. This is a great experience.
Tell the listeners where you're right now.
Currently, I'm actually back in my home base where I was born and raised in Kansas City, Kansas. So American Midwest, North American continent.
What is Kansas like?
My favorite joke about Kansas is that it's so flat you can watch your dog run away from home for 3 days. It's not the most exciting landscape geographically, but it does have its own inherent natural beauty. And I've always had this little bit of a theory that you have an affinity for the geography, the geographical features for where you grew up. And to this day, people ask, "Oh, do you prefer the mountains or do you prefer the beach?" And I'm like, I prefer the plains. I prefer big, flat, open spaces.
I'm from Norwich, which is flat. Well,
Oh
Norfolk is
yeah.
flat in UK, so I'm fairly used to those flat lying lands.
Hmm.
So coming here with mountains in the background in Vancouver is a bit of a culture shock in terms of nature, but it's awe-inspiring as well because it's so unique. Yeah, I'm not used to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Very different, geographical landscape from where both of us have grown up. But
Yeah.
and I will say Kansas actually is not as flat as people imagine it to be,
Mm.
particularly Kansas City in the east part of the state. A lot of river valleys, river bluffs, and, by no means dramatic landscape. But if you ever have to walk across or cycle across parts of the state, you realize there's a lot more hills than you think there are.
And of course, people would probably know the name because of the NFL, right? Not a huge NFL
Yeah.
fan, but obviously the Kansas City Chiefs, if I got that right. I've done pretty
Yeah,
good this
Kansas
year.
City Chiefs. We've just won the Super Bowl this
Yeah.
last week here, and that's our third win in 5 years, I think.
Yeah. Doing well.
So yeah, I can't say I'm a big NFL fan myself, but I got to support the home team, and it's been fun to be here when it's all kicked off and we've won. So it's been a great experience. So the big party mentality.
Yes, of course. Okay. Okay. We're going to go into the backstory and early travel memories for you. So you
Mhm.
mentioned you grew up in Kansas City. So I'm quite interested to know about just the location of where you are. What are the travel options for you growing up? Because it's quite far from anywhere, from either coast, I'd imagine, of your own country. But even going internationally must be a heck of a journey.
Yeah, I mean, we're about as far as you can get from the ocean right here. I mean, there are a fun fact about Kansas. There are no naturally occurring lakes in the entire state. 200 miles by 400 miles rectangle, and all bodies of water that are lakes are man-made during like the Roosevelt administration and
Ah,
FDR. So there's everything is like artificial lakes. There's rivers and ponds and things, but so yeah, we're really far from, dramatic seascape and the coast. So in terms of travel, I mean, really growing up, it was where you're going to go in the States. You're going to go down to the Ozark Mountains, are you going to go skiing in Colorado? Are you going to go to California, Florida? International travel, growing up, there are actually no international flights from Kansas City Airport. There are now.
mm,
But growing up, it was pretty limited in terms of destinations. So I never left the country till I was about 17 or 18 years old.
hmm
I was able to go to France on an exchange program. But apart from that, yeah, there's not a lot of international options. So, but that said, Kansas City is very multicultural as a destination. It's brought a lot of people from around the world here. And so in that regards, it's kind of nice because you can actually visit the world without having to go too far.
Ah,
It's all on your
nice.
doorstep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you would assume really that being where you are location wise, as you say, it's the furthest point of entry, well, from the point of entry of America, right? From the, I guess, the ports
Yeah.
traditionally, but also the major
Yeah.
airports are probably quite far away. So it would
Yeah.
take a journey just to get there and settle there. So that's quite interesting that it's multicultural.
Yeah, yeah, it really has quite a big draw. So a lot of people, in fact, my neighborhood community, just about a mile down the road, has one of the largest Somali and Algerian populations in the country.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, we're pretty multi-ethnic in a lot of ways, but people tend not to realize that because they just sort of think, oh, it's American Midwest, it's
Yeah.
corn-fed, beef eating, hamburgers and pizza, and American Midwest, but there's a lot more going on here than people think.
Okay. And for your family growing up, was there a lot of travel involved in your lifestyle, or was that more of a treat, or if you can one year you'll go? Like, how did that work out?
It was really a lot later in life that I began to travel. But growing up, my parents really had this perspective that they wanted their children to have a global mindset.
Hmm.
So they did a really good job of making sure that we were exposed to different cultures and the arts. There's always mother's field trips, to the art museum or to the
Yeah.
cultural festival of whatever was happening in town. And my parents were involved a lot with Christian missionary work for a long time. And so they really had connections to a lot of the international world there and had invited people into our home
Mm.
growing up. And so I remember hosting, young boys from Kenya who were part of a global boys choir. They had friends from El Salvador. We had neighbors from Iran who came to visit, and they'd always bring food and tell some stories about everything. So I had, fond memories growing up of the world coming to my doorstep before I was able to go anywhere else.
Okay. And was there a trip that you can remember back in those days where it maybe did spark something in you travel wise, maybe thinking, oh, I'd like to do more of that in the future, or an experience maybe that maybe got you going?
I like to blame my mother. I think it's genetic. She
Okay.
she tells the story when she was growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, where she was a child. She was out, playing with her friends, and one of her friends' mothers one day said to her, she's like, "Why do you always have to be going someplace?" Because she was always, let's go
Mm.
to the corner store, let's go down and watch them building the highway, let's go downtown Chicago, let's go, to the train tracks, let's go where, she's always going someplace. And I just feel like that's kind of been bred into me from a young age. Always wanted to explore, always wanted to see new things from as young as I can remember. I always wanted to grow up to be Indiana Jones or, some international explorer, archaeologist, anthropologist. Just kind of it's been in me since I was young. So I don't know, genetic. I'm gonna blame it on my mother.
It's quite a hard question, isn't it? I know I remember the time because I wasn't that travel focused back when I was younger, but I think for a lot of people, it's hard to remember the exact moment, isn't it? If it's like ingrained in you from a young age, there's not really an experience as per se, but I guess there must have been something in your mind that liked it initially, because I guess there's a lot of people who don't like it. So it's quite an interesting discussion.
Well, when I was 4 years old, I remember my parents took us to California for it was
Mm.
the Summer Olympics in 1984. So that's going to date my age right there. But we were in the old brown station wagon trundling across the American West, and I had fallen asleep in the back, and we're driving across the Great Plains, and we get to Colorado. And I woke up, from my nap, and there was these mountains in the distance, and just in awe of this totally different geography. I just piped up and I said, well, where did those come from? And I remember that road trip with really vivid memory. As young as I was, I remember going across the desert. I remember seeing giant saguaro cactuses in Arizona. I remember the Grand Canyon. My dad
Mm.
picked me up and held me over the railing, so I could see down to the Grand Canyon. I can hear my mother's voice to this day saying, "What are you doing?" To my father as I'm not so smartly kicking and screaming over the edge of the Grand Canyon. Uh, but made our way all the way to California, and we went to Catalina Island. And I remember being on this ferry boat out there and watching the flying fish jump out of the water.
Mm.
And when I was four, that same trip, we went to the San Diego Zoo. And my parents bought for me this plush gorilla, this little stuffed gorilla, and I named him Sluppy. I don't know where that name came from, but I was 4 years old, and that was the name I gave that plush animal. And Sluppy is still with me to this day. He travels the world with me and
Ah,
has lived every place I've lived, and has had his photograph taken in front of various world monuments, and has a little bit of an Instagram following on my page.
okay.
So I think, I'm going to blame it on my mother. I'm going to blame it on the trip to California when I was 4 years old, and I'm going to blame it on Sloppy. That's where it all comes from.
Slappy, little cult hero. So going into adolescence, I imagine college is maybe on your thought process, as a lot of Americans, well, some Americans do. So did that come into your thought about where to go to college? And you mentioned at 17 or 18 you went to France. So how did that
Mhm.
work its way into being the first international trip?
So yeah, so like most Americans, I grew up with the idea that when I went away to college, I was going to go away to
Yeah.
college. That's a very common trend here in the States. I know it's less common in the UK and in Europe, but definitely just kind of, 18, get out of the house. And so I opted to go to Chicago, go to school in Chicago, which is where my extended family was from.
Mm.
So it was a kind of a home away from home. Um, and gain some independence that way. But it was actually when I was still in high school, it was my junior year. I was 17 years old, and there was an exchange program. It was a 3-week program that we had a partnership with a school in France, and I studied French in high school. I loved it and thought it would be a great opportunity. And so had some very generous friends who helped finance that trip, and I spent 3 weeks in a homestay in France. And I think that really just changed my life. It really opened me up to the much broader, wider world that there is out there. Having already had this taste of growing up with these, foreign visitors in our home and
Mm.
the world coming to my doorstep, I now actually got to step off that doorstep somewhere else and taste it for myself. And the rest is history. I will forever travel now.
Any culture shock when you landed in France?
Oh goodness, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, oh yeah. I remember. I think I cried myself to sleep actually. And I'd say fun fact, not a fun fact, a sad fact is every time I have moved country to settle in a new place for a mid to long term period of time, I have cried myself to sleep the first night every night.
Okay. Right.
Culture shock is real,
Yeah.
even if you
Yeah.
know it and you're used to it many times over. I have just always found that transition kind of lends itself to a certain amount of grief, a grief for having lost the previous home for
Hmm.
wherever you were in the world,
Yeah.
and a kind of anxiety about, is this really going to work? Like, can I,
Mm.
temporarily call this new place home, and how long will it take before it feels like that? Um, yeah, I don't, as much as we glamorize the nomadic lifestyle, it really is difficult when every place is home and no place is home at the same time.
Yeah, I think those challenges are probably not talked about a lot because of the world we live in now with social media. I think it's glamorized to be almost
Mm,
all positive, but there are real interesting questions you've got to answer, haven't you? Like, yeah, like you say, can you make this a home? Are you going to miss the people
mm,
that you were friends with in your last home? Can you make friends in a new home? How are you going to make money? Like, all these things come into it. Is it
yeah.
worth it? Is it worth the stress? It's actually quite underrated problem of travel. Problem's probably a bit of a wrong word, really. But in France, where did you stay, and did you try and immerse yourself maybe in like the French culture in terms of the traditional, like, learning French, maybe trying to speak French, but also maybe their cuisine is a bit different. Did you try and do that sort of stuff, or get into like football or rugby? Like, how did you immerse yourself?
Yeah, so that first trip was only 3 weeks, and so it was very much just a cultural taste kind of
Yeah.
program. Lived with the family, had a host brother who was my age, went to school with him, took day trips around. and it really was just a great experience. I loved the whole thing, and I'm still in touch with that host brother and that host family.
Oh,
We
nice.
email once a year, Christmas letters, Christmas cards.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, gosh, it's 25 years now, and I'm
Mm.
still, I went on to major in French as an undergrad. I double majored in French and communication, and so I really threw myself into the language and the culture, and decided to sort of make a go of it while I was there, and ended up going back to France and doing a semester abroad while I was in college, and then did a year of teaching in a French public school the year after I graduated from college
Okay.
from uni.
Nice.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
spent all told probably put together about 2 years worth of time in France, but it was broken up into different pieces. That was my first foray into the overseas world. Would have been France. That initial homestay exchange, and then the study abroad in the year after. Yeah, it was all building
Mm.
towards more.
Okay. And to finish on France, what was maybe some of the things you loved about it? Like, did you love the culture? Like, did you find it hard or tough to settle in? I think France gets a sort of mixed reception sometimes. Like, I guess people go to Paris and it's like, oh, Parisians are pretty tough and maybe not too kind to the tourists sometimes. But there's other parts of France basically. So I do
Yeah.
get a bit of an interest about people who don't maybe live in Paris but go somewhere else and what it's like.
Yeah, Paris is like any other big metropolitan city in the world in a lot of ways, in terms of just cosmopolitan culture and people. Like London, New York, LA,
Yeah.
you're going to have people who are just, they're head down focused, going to work, doing their thing, and all these tourists are just in the way of me living my daily life. So I can get that frustration. Having lived in London for a short while as well, I was like, oh gosh, like what are all these people doing here in my city? So yeah, I understand that sort of coldness that comes across, but outside of Paris, and even in Paris, you find pockets of good, friendly people. But I think I loved really just exploring the differences and commonalities, really.
Hmm.
Just beginning to understand just how diverse and broad the human experience was, but also how much tied us together. And so it really was a sort of intercultural experience. I think that really drew me in. I have fond memories of France. There were things that I loved about it. I loved the history and the culture and the language and the ability to communicate, and how much progress I made with that. Sort of my own mini successes. I remember at one point, fun story. So the year after I was teaching in France for a year, and I was walking down the street one day, just Sunday afternoon, I think, just doing some shopping. And it was a pretty busy afternoon, and there was a survey taker who was on the pathway on the side of the road there. And she was sort of corralling people to fill in the survey, some marketing survey, I think.
Hmm.
And and so, she sees me and sort of like, lock eye contact for a moment. And then I'm trying to dodge the survey because I'm
Yeah.
having one of these, like, I don't want to speak French days,
Okay.
as conversant as I was and as fluent as I was in language, and still am to some degree. You just have those days when you kind of wanted to turn your brain off on the language and be in your own thoughts. And so I'm trying to sort of dodge the survey taker. And but the way the crowds pressured me, I kind of ended up being just face to face with this girl. And she says, "Oh, would you like," in French, she says, "Would you like to take the survey?" And I just bold-faced lied. And I just said, "I'm sorry," in French. I said,
Yeah.
"I'm sorry, I don't speak French very well. Pardon, mais je parle pas français très bien." And she looked at me and she says, "That's a lie. You're my English teacher, and I know you speak fluent French." And I went red in the face because I didn't recognize her, and I was like, "Oh, damn! All right, I guess I'll take your survey." I don't even remember what it was about, but it was just sort of being caught out, on that moment on the street. Um, but yeah, just I think living in another culture and having to use the language on a daily basis is actually, that's a really big challenge.
Mm.
I think as English speakers, we often um, forget how difficult it is to have to operate in a second language all
Yeah.
the time,
Mm.
because we have the luxury of the world, really, of it being the lingua franca in the world. And so really forcing yourself to speak another language and immerse yourself in it is really really good challenge, and I think is worth the effort and the time. And those little successes where you have people be like, "Oh yeah, I know you speak French fluently. You can take my survey." It's like, I know I didn't want to speak this language today, but someone at least validates my efforts. So,
I think you're totally right about the whole language thing. There's two facets to it really, where we do not appreciate learning another language because we don't need to. And I think
yeah,
we are pretty lazy as a English speaking first mother tongue group of people of learning another language. And the second
yeah,
part of that is if you're Italian getting stuck in France and you both can't speak each other's language, you're going to go to English, I imagine. So the problem
yeah,
we've got as English speaking people is if you're trying to speak the language and you're stuck, they're probably going to just speak to you in English. And it's like, oh. So maybe it's quite hard to learn in another country. I don't know if that's an excuse, but I can imagine if they get a whiff that you speak English, they might come back with you in English, but you actually want them to come back in French to try and learn and understand the
yeah,
responses and stuff.
yeah. It takes an intentional effort, really,
Mm,
and I, for my years of living in Iraqi Kurdistan, I did give it an effort. I wish I had given it more.
mm.
I'm proud of the effort that I did give, and I'm actually quite pleased that I made the progress that I did in Sorani Kurdish, but I certainly could have done a whole lot more. But it is difficult because the default is English, and people want to practice their English with native speakers when you are in their home turf. So
Yeah,
it's a
absolutely.
difficult catch-22.
Yeah. And before we get to you mentioned Kurdistan there, and you mentioned pre-recording that you've lived in the UK. So it's not my notes
Mhm.
here. Where did you live and why did you live in the UK?
Yeah, so all told, I spent about 12 years in the UK.
Mm,
The first 7 were in Shropshire, in a rural little tiny village, not far from the Welsh border.
hmm
And I went over to work in an outdoor activity center. I was in sort of middle management, running the activities training program
hmm
for the interns and the international volunteers. So went into that thinking I probably wouldn't stay for longer than 2 months because I was like, England, it rains all the time. Who wants to live
Yeah.
there? Ended up staying 7 years and naturalized as a citizen in that job. So clearly I fell in love with it. And I think I mentioned earlier, I mean, America is the culture of my heart, but the UK is the culture of my head.
Mm,
I did all of my real adulting experiences there rather than
hmm
here. It was my first real job after graduating college,
Got it.
my first apartment, my first car,
Yeah.
my first time really having to pay taxes. All of that was in the UK. And so having to come back to the States and do that now 20 odd years later is like, oh goodness, I have to relearn a lot of this.
Yeah.
So I spent 7 years in Shropshire and then took a gap year and traveled backpacked around the world.
hmm
Um, and ended up landing back in London and working as a flight attendant for 2 years with British Airways. So it's a bit of a spell in there. And then I ended up staying after that British Airways job for another year and a half or two before I ended up moving across to Iraqi Kurdistan. So it's a bit of an interesting trajectory there on hopping
Yeah.
around the world. But all said and done, about 12 years worth of time in the UK.
Okay. And that leads me nicely onto the flight attendant role first, because that's quite an interesting role to have, especially for a short amount of time. 2 years, you just mentioned there. That's quite a quick get in and get out. So there must be a few reasons for that, maybe.
It was it was the greatest lifestyle and the worst job.
Got it.
People would say to me, they're like, "Oh man, like I love your job. I just want to travel
Mm,
like you get to travel all the time." And I'd want to punch people in the face because I'd be like, "No, you don't love to travel. You love to arrive." Like nobody loves sitting in 30 inches of leg space with a 4-inch screen and a tray meal shoved in front of them, drinking tiny cans of Coke while you're, waiting for 12 hours to land somewhere else. Like nobody loves the airport security and the tight
yeah.
cramped spaces and the smell of farts in the cabin for 8 hours where you're traveling. I mean, it's not pleasant. It's not a pleasant experience overall, to do that every day.
Mm,
And it just so happens, my office was 30,000 feet in the sky, but it's a terrible office to be in all the time. And while you would get some luxury of time down route, more often than not, you were too jet lagged to really enjoy it.
Got it.
Because you had to
Mm,
turn around within 24 hours and operate the flight home. And
yeah.
so it wasn't like you just could, go and get drunk and have a party and have fun. you would in sort of a window of time, but then you had a cutoff point because you're like, I've got to get enough sleep and be sober and ready and prepared to operate all the safety procedures for this flight home, and deal with, customer service in the sky. So,
It's basically customer service, isn't it?
the front-facing role is customer service.
Mm.
Most airlines will tell you that the actual role is safety and security. And in many ways, that is true. Like you
Yeah.
do have a lot of safety elements and protocol to uphold, but the minute to minute, front-facing role is very customer service, and so you're having to juggle multiple identities really in the same, several hours
Mm.
of that confined space. And I found after a while it was just really taxing to never really know where I was,
Yeah.
to always be tired, to be eating terrible airplane food every day of my life, um, and to really just not really being able to hold any relationships,
Mm.
romantic or friendship or familial or whatever, because you would end up with, a day off on a random Tuesday morning, and then the following Friday afternoon, and then maybe you get, next Wednesday off, and who's free on, Thursday at 12 midday in London to hang out
Yeah.
with you, and everybody's got a 9 to 5. So, it was a really depressing job, because in the end, what I've told people is, we can glamorize this global lifestyle of being nomadic, but home is really where you are known.
Mm.
And if you are in a position where you are never able to be known because you are always on the move every
Mm.
24 hours, then home is everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Indeed. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I spoke to a few flight attendants on their podcast. It's quite interesting because I think a lot of people have a lot of questions.
Yeah. It's a desperately lonely job, to be honest.
Is it? Okay.
In the words of a really good friend of mine, it's the perfect job for the shallow extrovert. You rock up to the airport and you meet your crew, who you never fly with more than a handful of times in your career. Your crew
Oh, that
changes
was my
slightly.
question. Do you sort of
Yeah.
coordinate to make sure you're on the same flight?
No, you end up really having different schedules, and I can probably count on one hand the number of crew members that I flew with more than twice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you end up sort of meeting all new people every flight. You're in a different hotel room every third night. You have random days off. You're always jet lagged and always tired and never really know where you are. And the customers are just this annoying inconvenience of 8 hours that you have chicken and beef to you before you can go to sit in the hot tub in the hotel down route. So, you end up never really forming deep, meaningful connections with people.
Mm.
And after a while, I started to feel a bit like I was a helium balloon where the string had been cut and I was left to just soar into the stratosphere, which sounds exhilarating until you realize that the only way to come down is when you run out of gas or you burst.
Yeah. Okay. And on like long haul flights, do you not get like an extra 2 or 3 days to have a layover, or is it 24 hours and you're back in again?
Yeah, so long haul flights, most legacy airlines now, you have, I mean, they, like most industries in the world, they're trying to squeeze more work for less pay.
Of course.
And so back in the glamour days of flying, you might, fly off to Auckland, New Zealand and have, 14 days before you would turn around and come home. Well, now you get 24 hours in Sydney before you're on the way back to London.
Goodness.
So, it's a pretty rough turnaround on a lot of flights.
Mm.
I think the longest layover I had in any one particular city might have been 3 days,
Okay.
maybe.
Wow.
In general, you had 24 hours, maybe 2 days,
Mm.
to explore and then turn around and come home. So, and you're always going different directions. You'd be in LA one day from London, and then you're back, and then 2 days later you're off to Tokyo. And so you're literally, hopping 24 hours of time zones either direction, and so what do you do at 4 a.m. except order sushi off the menu in the hotel in Yokohama when you're wide awake and the rest of the world's asleep?
It's such a strange job. You must be tired all the time because of the time zone shifts. It's got to be a young person's game. But you do see
It
a lot
is.
of flight attendants who are a bit older. So I don't know how, unless they're late into it, maybe, I'm not sure. But I can't imagine you'd want to do that sort of job for very long because that would just not be
I would argue that
doable.
the flight attendants who are older only look older because it ages you.
Technically, it would,
um,
right? If you're going from different time zones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean that's not entirely true. It's a bit unkind to say actually,
Yeah.
because there are, if you've been in the industry for a while, you actually get grandfathered into a pretty convenient contract. But if you're starting out now, you get, given the newer contracts, which are less glamorous and harder
Yeah.
to sustain. And my aunt, she was in the flight attendant industry for 20 years and she loved it. She retired out of it,
Okay.
and has great things to say about it. But
Yeah.
for my part, I left because it really was affecting my health. I was always tired. I was always hungry. And I actually ended up having to have my gallbladder removed. I can never really fully say that it was because of the poor sleep and poor diet, but there's a strong correlation there that makes me think that, I really had to quit because it was adversely affecting my health.
Yeah, I don't blame you for quitting for that, and that's got to be related to the lifestyle. Has to be.
Yeah.
Um, which kind of leads me on to like passengers causing you grief and probably not helping your lifestyle and your health. I mean, we all have been on planes and we've all seen some interesting behaviors. Is there any that just makes you laugh now, but at the time was just horrendous, like in terms of what passengers were doing, to be pre-boarding or boarding or on the flight midway?
I regularly say that I'll at one point write, my next book will be
Yes.
about the flight attendant lifestyle, because there's just story upon story. None of them reflect well on the human condition, really. I like to say that, people would check their brain into their hold baggage before they got on board,
Fair.
because you would just get the most absurd questions. Some of them would be ridiculously funny. I mean, my favorite, some that just made me laugh out loud. We'd give out, tea and coffee, and with that, you get these little sachets of UHT milk,
Yeah.
that ultra heat treated, it's shelf life stable milk.
Yeah.
And they're just like these little, plastic sachets, like a ketchup packet kind of thing. And I remember one day, I'm handing out, these packets with the tea and coffee as we're going down the aisle, and this lady stops me and she says, "Sir, what kind of animal is a ute?" And I said, "Pardon?" She's like, "A ute. This says it's ute milk." I said, "Oh, UHT. That's shelf stable milk. It's long life ultra heat treated." And she's like, "Oh." She seriously thought it was, an animal, like, it was ute milk, like yak milk or cow's milk or
Yeah.
camel's
Yeah.
milk. Um,
Bloody hell.
so there are funny moments like that. Other things that I'd probably get in trouble for if I really confessed out loud, in terms of, shenanigans that crew would get up to on board, puffing from the oxygen tanks out the back, or, playing, hide the banana, in passengers, seat back pockets or whatever. I mean, we've had some pretty fun games that we would do. And then there's always the annoying things with, passengers who are just, unaware of the requirements, that they needed to sit down, that the seatbelt sign was on for their safety, that
Yeah.
you really do need to keep the exits clear, that takeoff and landing is the most dangerous part of the flight, that turbulence is not dangerous at all, really, as long as you're sat down and seated.
Yeah.
I mean, I could say plenty of negative things, but I'll save that for a book and another podcast episode.
I think even as a frequent flyer, especially last year, even other passengers annoy me, and I'm not even working. Like the seatbelt one is probably in the top three that I've witnessed, where
Yeah,
people just cannot sit down or are so unaware that lights on, they just get up
yeah,
and get something like that. Especially during takeoff or landing. It's like, what are you doing? I
yeah.
can't get my head around it.
Non-compliance is probably one of the hardest things to deal with. And I
Yeah.
remember probably one of the worst situations was we had an elderly woman from India, and she'd flown in from Delhi, had landed in London, was connecting on to Los Angeles to go to her son's or grandson's wedding, I believe.
Mm.
And I'm pretty sure she had dementia or early onset Alzheimer's, and she was traveling alone, apparently, and kept asking where her son was and was there an ATM so she could go and get money for her son. She needed to go to a cash machine. And we're on the aircraft. Like, we're taxiing to the head of the runway. Like, we've done the safety demonstration.
Scary.
Haven't taken off yet, but we're taxiing. And she's in the back galley demanding that she find her son. She needs to go to the cash machine. And she doesn't speak English. And so we're, kind of asking if anybody speaks, I think it was Marathi, as we figured out she spoke the Marathi, was maybe her language from India.
Mm.
And so we finally found another passenger who spoke her language. and he's trying to assuage her and get her to sit down and put her seatbelt on because we're getting ready to take off, and she refused, just outright refused, and was kind of getting frantic. And so finally we called the captain and we said, we've got a passenger who's not compliant. Can you come help us out? So he comes down to the back of the aircraft, shoulder stripes and stars and full on captain's hat, and says to this woman, and and this other man translates as well, ma'am, you need to sit down. We're getting ready to take off. And she looks at the captain and says, no, and shoves him, pushes him back. And it was, it was an old lady shove, but it was physical contact and defiance.
Of course.
And the captain took off his hat, put it under his arm, and he said, that's it. This woman's not flying with us. We're going back to the gate, and delayed the flight 4 hours while we all sat, got her bags unloaded, and she got deported back to India. Offloaded off the plane and deported all the way back to Delhi. And I just wanted to tell people, like, when you are told to do something, like, there's a reason. Like, we're not just like power hungry, like, cabin crew bitches. Like, we're really like, can I say that on your show?
Yeah, of course can,
like, it really, there's reasons in terms of, compliance and safety measures and protocol, and and if you're going to shove a captain, game over, you're done.
And I guess, like, adhering yourself to a flight attendant, I guess that's just do all the rules, comply, I guess don't annoy you. Which for me, it's just like sit down in your right seat, put your seatbelt on when it comes on, watch your TV.
I would say just go out of your way to have good manners. You see the flight attendant coming down, we're asking the same question to 300 people. Do you want tea or coffee, chicken or beef? Do you want the pasta or the the curry? What do you want? So by the time we get to you, you've heard us say this for at least the 3 rows in front of you. Like, take your goddamn headphones off so that you can hear what the options are, smile, know what you want, and make a decision. Like, because we're on a limited time frame. Like, we've got to get all of this out and serve you and secure the galley and pack everything up and make sure everything is ready. And sometimes on a short flight, there's not enough time to do that. So a smile, the headphones off, making up your mind, being polite, allowing us to get through with the carts, letting us do the routine, is really goes a long way. And I know people think they're being helpful by maybe bringing their trays into the galley and like helping clean up after themselves. Let us do it. Like, we've got a whole system. There's an organization. Smile, be polite, say thank you, and be compliant. Treats go a long way. I will say, we had a couple of passengers, they'd offer, they'd bring on board chocolate, or they'd bring on some sort of whatever. And that, well, that's not ever going to get you, great extra perks. Like, we'll treat you nice, give us a smile, give us a Hershey's kiss, and just say thank you.
What about tips? Because I know in US, some passengers do tip the flight attendants, right? But someone told me that they're not technically allowed to accept it. But if they slip it in the back pocket, it's fine.
Yeah, not technically allowed. I never had that opportunity. Nobody ever really tipped me. Maybe I was a terrible flight attendant. I don't know, but a moody old git. I have no idea. But yeah, technically we're not allowed to accept. And that doesn't go very far, I think, to endear us to you. I think it makes us, like, if I were to receive a tip, I think it would make me feel I'd kind of been thrown into a role of servitude, as opposed to seen as a fellow human being who wanted to be treated with respect. And I think that really goes a whole lot further, is, see us as a fellow human being who are probably jet lagged and tired and as cranky as you are for having gone through the airport, and we have to go through security just like you. And, be kind and polite and go the extra mile to smile, and, all be well.
Just a couple of things from me. Please head to my new website, www.wingingittravelpodcast.com. The link is in the show notes, where you can access everything about this podcast, how to support the podcast, where to find episodes, a little bit of information about me, how to contact me, how to sponsor the podcast, how to be a guest. Everything is on there for you to take a look at. And secondly, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I've got weekly episodes coming out for all my travels, pretty much the last year, and going a little bit further back. and of course, my future travels coming up in 2024. It'd be great to see you on there. It helps podcasts gain that extra bit of traction, and I'm really enjoying showing you my content I have from the last year or so. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to the Greek island quarantine situation.
How long do we have?
Well, we've got to get to Kurdistan, yeah? Talk us through that. Is it related to COVID?
Yeah. So I just a year ago released my first book. It's a memoir called As Large as Your Spirit, a reverse refugee memoir. That's based on that quarantine experience. The sort of brief synopsis is in early March of 2020, I decided I needed to sort of take a short break, a spring break, planned from school. I was working at a school in Iraq, and I was working on my master's degree at the same time. And so I said, let's go, kind of someplace nice. We'll maybe splash out a little bit more than I normally would for a holiday. And let's kind of go partly off grid. I kind of want to, disconnect a little bit. Not completely, but, just make it a little bit harder to connect with the rest of the world for, go a little bit remote. And so I can focus and recenter and then come back, with full vigor to finish off the academic year.
Yeah.
So flew off to Greece, found this nice resort package on a remote Greek island. It was Samos Island, one of the lesser touristed. It was a large island, but yeah, lesser touristed than some of the big ones. And found a nice outdoor activity package in this luxury resort villa on the seaside, and flew out there with a carry-on bag because I was only going to be there for a week. And the day I landed I spent a couple of days on mainland Greece, and then the day I landed on the island, the World Health Organization used the words global pandemic, and the dominoes toppled and everything shut down and borders were closed. And what was going to be a 5-day vacation on this Greek island by myself ended up being stretched out into 5 months, which in retrospect, it's nice to say, oh, I spent 5 months in this luxury resort. Well, in the pandemic, it was, another 2 weeks, another 2 weeks, another two. It was this perpetual 2 weeks of like, when is this going to be, when is this going to be lifted, with no real end date in sight. And so during my time, I, lived in this villa and stayed on this island for 5 months, and partway through discovered a refugee camp on the opposite side of the island from where I lived, and ended up volunteering to teach English in this refugee camp. And the kind of crux of the story really is, here I am, a man from the West, caught in Greece, trying to get back to my home in the Middle East, now crossing paths with all these refugees from the Middle East, caught in Greece, trying to get to the West. Wow, and our lives intersected, ended up changing each other's life paths really in many ways. And it's a memoir really about what it means to find a place to call home, because we're talking about refugees and also talking about myself sort of being quarantined away from my own home, but also the metaphorical sense of home, of what does it mean to have a place where you belong, within yourself and within your community and the people around you. And so it mirrors some of the stories of the refugees that I worked with and shares some of their stories, but also dives deep into my own personal psyche and what does it mean to really find a place to call home when you're nomadic and you've lived a life around the world.
How did you reconcile the fact that you were staying in a luxury resort on the other side of the island when these guys were, I'm not sure what conditions they're in, but I mean, assuming they weren't amazing, when you are kind of conversing each day during a pandemic?
Yes, that was a really hard reality to swallow. Because on one hand, I'm living in this luxury resort, which I was living there dirt cheap. The owner was like, "This is act of God. I can't charge you full price. Like, this is absolutely ridiculous. So just pay me monthly rent like it's an apartment, and like here's the keys to the laundry." So I basically had run of my own little unit for the equivalent price of an apartment in town or whatever. So I mean, it was still putting me out of pocket, but it wasn't nowhere near what it would have cost if I'd actually paid full price. So I was feeling the financial strain, the financial burden, but also going an hour across the island by bus to go volunteer teach with refugees who were living under canvas and would come into class, one day we had a student come in and he had a big gash across his nose where at night the rats had made their way into his tent and had bitten his nose in his sleep, and he had this big old gash, this scar. And it was just, it was really this eye-opening experience to see the refugee process firsthand, the asylum seeking process, because at that point they weren't technically refugees, they were still asylum seekers, there's a distinction, which I learned over time. So reconciling sort of my lifestyle with what I was witnessing, I think, on a level, it was, I had this sort of white man's privilege guilt.
Yeah.
But also I had a lot of empathy because I was really finding myself in a comparable situation. By no means similar, but comparable in the sense that I was now in a place that wasn't my home, in a transient sort of situation that was never meant to be permanent, having to sort of struggle financially to figure out how I was going to, what my next move is going to be and how I was going to make this work. And so, while my struggles were nothing like those of refugees in the camp, the experience really gave me this opportunity to reflect empathically on their experience by recognizing those touch points that were common, even if the expression was different.
And did you get to know certain asylum seekers, refugees personally? I mean, if you're going there for 5 months because of COVID, right, and you can't leave, you are a regular face for them in their lives, day to day or week to week. Like, did you get to understand where they come from? Like, I guess the different countries maybe, and how they got there. I'm assuming by boats. I mean, how did you get to an island? And did you learn all that process as well of like getting to know them, why and what their aim is, where they're planning to go to eventually?
Yeah, it was really fascinating to hear a lot of their stories and to find out about their motivations for leaving their home countries, their process for ending up, how they ended up on Samos as opposed to any other asylum seeking center. And I'm still friends with many of them actually on social media. Every once in a while we'll have a flurry of messages. One gentleman in particular, most everyone has resettled into Europe at this point. So, they've now rebuilt their lives in Germany or Austria or mainland Greece even. And so it's nice to see their successes and their victories as they've, found new homes. And so it's been nice to keep up with a lot of those students. But in the process, hearing about their immigration stories, absolutely fascinating. And it was eye-opening to really see the global refugee crisis from their side, from their perspective, because it's easy in Western countries to sort of, particularly in the US, we've got the border with Mexico, in the UK, you've got immigration from Europe and Brexit, and, how are we going to, long sagas politically, about all of that global migration. But 1% of the world's population has been displaced due to conflict. 1%. Which is a substantial number of people.
God, 80 million?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So it's a significant number of people. The size of several, major metropolitan areas, all uprooted. A lot of them have left for reasons that life at home became untenable. So either political instability or global conflict, or lifestyle choices back home, political alliances, whatever it may be, economic disparity. Now more and more climate change is forcing people out.
That's interesting.
So yeah, Iraq, where I lived, is rated as the fourth most vulnerable country in the world for climate change. And it's also, has a history of political instability and conflict. You add all of that together, and there's mass emigration from Iraq and I have friends who, would seek the illegal route out and into Europe. I'd always recommend people go legally if you can. Really try and go the legal route, because illegally is terrible if it's unsuccessful. You risk death, or what I would venture to say worse, years of refugee camp confinement.
Like the conditions in Calais, for example, are horrendous, aren't
Oh, yeah. The one on Samos was built originally to house, I think, 600 asylum seekers. And at the time I was on the island, there were 6,000 asylum seekers that were crammed into the official camp and then an unofficial shanty town outside of the camp that was referred to as the jungle.
Right.
And the town that hosted the refugee camp only had 6,000 citizens. So it was a 1-to-1 ratio of asylum seekers to local Greeks, which caused a great strain on local resources and goodwill.
Right.
And it was a really tenuous situation, very difficult.
And before we move on to Kurdistan, my actual question was going to be, how did the local Greeks find it? Because I think from another perspective, I don't think we appreciate this enough, especially somewhere like Greece, where I think boats from Turkey come across or other places. A lot of the islands are just not prepared for this or even expected it, and yet they find themselves housing a lot of asylum seekers. And I guess it's a bit of a shock to their system. Have you seen the film Swimmers, where the two Syrian swimmers who compete in the Olympics, they're not part of a country, they're kind of neutrals, and they win gold, and they arrive at a Greek island, and they walk past this cafe. It's got nice little chairs and a coffee, and people drink an espresso, but they won't give them water as they walk past. Right? There's a scene in there which kind of depicts what Greek island would be like if you landed there.
I haven't seen that movie, but that scene is all too familiar daily reality. I have witnessed very similar scenes just in my daily life on the island.
I can imagine the strain is real.
Yeah.
If you actually analyze that scene from just a neutral perspective, there's actually no difference at all. You could turn up wanting a coffee, and a refugee could turn up wanting a coffee, but they might get rejected, and you might get told yes. Like there's certain things that play there, isn't there?
Local opinion was pretty divided. There were the contingent that really, felt the need to help their neighbor in trouble. That were, good spirited and generous and wanted to do their part. As I said, it is a strain on the economy to support that many refugees. And it's also just a strain on goodwill, because a lot of them had been in the camps or been in the system, at least, not necessarily that particular camp, but in the system for sometimes up to 7 years. So, you're kind of at a point where you can only give out so many bottles of water, or you can only be so kind or so patient with the person who doesn't speak Greek or English or whatever language you're trying to communicate, before you just kind of give out and you're like, I'm done. My role in teaching English, when I spoke to the coordinator of the volunteer center, she's telling me all these tragic stories, similar things about, their lifestyle in the camp and, being stuck in a cycle and, years and years. And I was like, it's beginning to sound like teaching English is really the least of the priorities here. And she's like, oh, on the contrary, if these people can learn to speak English, even at a, poor level, it unlocks so many opportunities in terms of being able to navigate their cultural world, navigate legislation, navigate resources and services. Just even having a passing level unlocks so many opportunities. And she says, on the contrary, like learning English is the #1 priority for so many of them.
Wow.
Above and beyond finding long-term shelter or sustainable employment, like really that's the #1 for a lot of them. So it really made a lot of sense, and it really gave a lot of meaning and purpose to my role there, because here I was with the opportunity and the skills to do something and to make a difference, and to visibly see that difference, unfold in front of my eyes day to day was fantastic.
Okay. And if people want to hear or read more about that, they can check out your memoir, right?
Yeah, joeldavidbond.com. It's called As Large as Your Spirit. It's also available on Amazon.
Got it. Okay. Let's go on to Kurdistan, Iraq. So on your bio, you mentioned that you went there by choice. So I'm keen to see what was your thinking here, why Kurdistan, and what period of time was this in as well?
So I moved to Iraqi Kurdistan in late 2016.
Okay.
That was at the tail end of ISIS activity. They were still active in the country, but were nearing defeat. They were defeated in January of 2017, or declared defeated. At that point. So, moving to Iraqi Kurdistan was it was a bit of a bold leap, I'm not gonna lie. And I jokingly say that it was out of desperation. I had left my job at British Airways as a flight attendant, and
Oh
I'd
yeah.
kind of drifted in London for about a year and a half, trying to figure out what the next thing to do was.
Mm.
And kind of started my own little travel business, doing tours, and had some gigs teaching English privately, doing some tutoring lessons, and basically trying to sort of be a solopreneur in the world's most expensive city to live in, watching my bank
Yeah.
account drain, thinking I really need to get a real job. And I had registered on a lot of these English teaching websites because at that point in time, I just had a TESOL certificate, nothing more.
Mm.
And I was like, well, we'll find something, we'll just teach English somewhere in the world. And so I got an email in my inbox one day. It was my spam box, actually. And it's from a website called EnglishJobsInTurkey.com. And it said, come teach in Kurdistan, and it had this phenomenal salary for Turkish standards and offered to pay for my teaching certificate, like a
Mm.
proper teaching,
Yeah.
QTS. PGCE actually. So I was like, oh, that sounds great. And I'd spent a lot of time in Turkey. It was one of my major routes as a flight
Okay.
attendant, and my neighbors had been Turkish in
Hmm.
the UK, and so I spent time with their kids and spent holiday with them in Antalya, and I love Turkey, and so I was like, okay, this sounds like a great opportunity. So we replied to the email, and the guy got back. He said, "Oh, let's have within an hour." And he said, "Let's have a Skype call tomorrow." And I was like, "Okay, great, good timing," or I'm not sure what. So guy comes up on Skype the following day, and he says, "Oh, we're so excited that you want to come and teach in Iraq." And I literally just went in my head, and inside my head, I just said, "Oh shit, I did not read the small print of that
Yeah.
email." Well, I put on like my best poker face, and I was like, "Yes, tell me more
Yeah.
of the Iraq that you speak of." Just really sort of almost panicked, like, what did I just sign up for? What interview is this? What am I looking at? But I did my due diligence and did my research, and I had spent a fair amount of time around the Middle East.
Yeah.
I'd been in Turkey, been in Kuwait as a flight attendant, loved being in Azerbaijan, spent some good amount of time in Cairo and Tel Aviv. The Middle East didn't strike a chord of fear with me of Islamophobia like it does for a lot of Westerners who might
Yeah.
not have traveled there or be unfamiliar with the culture. So I said, you know what, you know, a lot of people live in the city, and I'd never heard of it, Suleimania. So it probably means nothing of note really happens there. It's not newsworthy, so let's just go and try it out. Like,
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
take their kids to school and take the dogs for a walk and go buy
Exactly. Yeah.
milk at the supermarket, so I'm gonna
Yeah.
go. So I did, and thought I might leave after 2 weeks, and stayed for yeah 7 years actually before I ended up having to leave. So really fell in love with it. So when I say I moved there by choice, more or less, I chose to stay. But the original inclination may not have necessarily been a conscious choice. I think it was a divine one. I was shoved that way.
Okay, and for people listening, they're probably thinking, "Oh, what is day-to-day life like?" Northern Iraq, isn't it? So it borders Turkey, right? Kurdistan. So,
Yeah, so I was about an hour from the border with Iran, actually.
oh, okay,
So
yeah,
the Kurdistan region sort of does this sort of loop across the top of Iraq,
yeah,
and borders Turkey, and follows the mountain range, the Zagros Mountains, down along the border with Iran. So I was kind of around on the hook of that Kurdistan region, closer to Iran. And like any place in the world, really, it's a day to day. People do their thing. You
hmm,
go to work and you raise your family, and you have the sort of those universals, those cultural universals that everybody wants to have, such as family and love and relationships and stability and success and growth and development. And how that looks, of course, might be different, but the goal really was the same. I found it just so fascinating to see this culture that had such bad press
yeah,
for years and years. I mean, decades of conflict, only to show up and to be greeted by such warmth and hospitality, and positivity, and just a vigor for life. Culturally, it's a very sort of these spectrum of cultural expressions, about like time orientation, and the way people look at family, or these sorts of things. And Kurdish culture in particular is very now focused. It's very in the moment.
Okay.
There isn't really a perspective towards the future. There's not a lot of
Hmm.
planning that goes on, what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after. For being a very past focused language, there's not a lot of focus on, dwelling on the past necessarily. It is very much of a here and now. Like, what are we doing in the moment? And which was delightful to sort of to live with that, to be like, okay, like I'm here and I'm alive and I'm awake, and let's go for a picnic for 8 hours and go dancing in the woods someplace, and in the mountains, and just enjoy good food and each other's company. So yeah, day-to-day life, same as any other place in the world, with
There you go.
also a lot of unique curiosities and quirks that you just have to be there to know it.
And that is the vital message, though, isn't it? That is this pretty much the same as anywhere else? And I think Kurdistan's got an interesting history. I don't know if people know much about it,
Mhm.
but I'm not a huge expert, but we all know the history of the Iraq War, etc. They kind of helped us defeat ISIS, the autonomous in the north. And when you read travel stuff this year and last year, Kurdistan is a place that people do recommend to go to. It's pretty safe compared to other
Mhm.
parts of the Middle East, and actually they're kind of running the show themselves. Sort of amalgamation of many different things.
You've touched on a lot of really key points there to really unpack. Kurdistan, it is a semi-autonomous region, so they do have their own parliament and their own branch of the military, the
Mm,
Peshmerga,
yeah,
um, that did help with the U.S. forces in defeating ISIS, and really have a strong presence. Really, they're sort of renowned for being great fighters.
yeah.
And they're very well respected, well revered, even within Kurdistan, the Peshmerga fighters. Um, but yeah, culturally, they are historically repressed. They're one of the largest demographics that don't have their own nation
Yep.
state.
Hmm.
So in Turkey, for a long time, they were very much repressed. Certain political factions within the Kurdish demographic are viewed as terrorist organizations from Turkey.
Yeah.
Although within the Kurdish population themselves, they would argue that that's not the case. In Iran, Kurdish identity is still in many ways suppressed.
Okay.
There's a small contingent of Kurdish in Syria, and because of the ongoing conflict there, a lot of them have emigrated or fled, and so that's a dwindling population.
Mm.
And then even within Iraq itself, because of recent conflict, a lot of the Kurdish population have been displaced. So there's a lot
Yeah.
of internally displaced people, internal refugees, so to speak. So there is, politically, it's kind of a very hodgepodge, dicey situation. But they've done a lot really to develop their own national identity and their own cultural identity and cultural pride, and they are quite distinct from their neighbors culturally. And it's hard to put a finger exactly on what makes it distinct. So there are definitely elements, crossovers, where it feels very Turkish, or it seems Persian, or there's a lot of Arabic loan words, or a lot of, Islamic influence, even though it's not historically Islamic. So there's a lot of kind of crossover, which lends itself to be like, is this really unique? But it is very unique. It's just a little bit hard to sort of put a short, succinct description on it. And it was interesting, really, to live in Kurdistan in the past couple of years and see it open up to the rest of the world, and to actually be resident there when the vanguard of the travel vloggers and the YouTubers
Yeah.
started showing up, and to
Yeah.
be like, dude, what are you doing in my space? Like, you think you're all edgy and exploring this place? I've lived here before you knew you could come here.
Yeah.
But at the same time, to have that newsworthiness kind of go out into the world and have people sort of share my love for Kurdistan, through their own voice and their own channels. And it is a bit clickbaity, I find, to have people be
Okay.
like, "Oh, this is Iraq," and it's
Mm.
Kurdistan, which is,
Yeah, yeah.
is it's semi on, autonomous region. Now, of course, since 2021, federal Iraq has opened up to visas on arrival.
Indeed. Yeah.
And so that, is again culturally distinct, fascinating to visit. It is worth your while if you are
Hmm.
of an adventure traveling, kind of mentality. And I would say to people, Iraq, both federal Iraq and Kurdistan, are safe places to visit, provided you have some experience with political instability and the developing world. By no stretch of the imagination is it entirely safe. And we can touch on that in a minute, because that is part of my exit story. But
Hmm.
um, I do recommend, if you have that experience and you've got the opportunity, it is a fascinating culture to visit. It's the cradle of civilization.
Yeah.
Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the birthplace of, writing and language and culture and history and, agriculture. It is absolutely fascinating. So, do go if you ever have a chance. Really, really do.
And did you get yourself immersed into the language and the food and stuff?
Yeah, so the official language of federal Iraq, of course, is Arabic, the Iraqi dialect, which again, Arabic has so many dialects. It's really, if you speak one dialect, you may not understand the other because they are quite distinct.
Nightmare.
Where I lived in Iraqi Kurdistan, the language was Kurdish, the Sorani dialect of Kurdish. And again, there's multiple dialects of Kurdish. And again, just because you understand one doesn't mean you'll understand the others. They are very distinct in many ways. So I immersed myself in some language learning lessons for Sorani, and managed to be passively conversant on a basic level. Taxis and shopkeepers and casual daily pleasantries in the marketplace. If I was spoken to directly and had kind of a visual context, I could really glean a lot more. But in a cocktail partying situation, it would just be a wash of language and sounds and gibberish. I would love to learn more, but now that I'm sort of extracted out of that culture, it's a lot harder to maintain it. So I fear I'm going to lose a lot of what I've learned. But linguistically, it's fascinating as a language. It's related to Farsi more than it is anything else.
Farsi, yeah.
Grammatically. And it's a little bit backwards to English. The verb at the end of the sentence must go. So you end up sounding like Yoda. You're sort of rearranging your, linguistic syntax in your head often. But it doesn't have any really difficult to pronounce sounds. The sort of the phonemes of the language really pair well with English. There's not anything that's really dramatically difficult. Like Arabic has a lot of guttural throat sounds that native English speakers might find hard, but Kurdish didn't really have many of those sounds, so it was really quite easy to pronounce. It was a fun language to really sort of get yourself around idioms that you would pick up daily, everyday jargon. I think it's part of the fun of living in a different cultures. You end up sort of incorporating a lot of linguistic elements and sort of create your hybrid language. So for people who, I know people who lived in Korea and they ended up speaking Kongrish, Korean English.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Or, in Singapore and, Singlish, or, I don't know, we sort of jokingly refer to it as Kurdlish. I don't know that would really be the phrase that we'd use, but, Kurdish and English, you'd end up mixing these words together and it's kind of the fun, insider's language, I suppose. It's like insider baseball, I guess. On a culinary level, the cuisine, it was Kurdish food I found was, it was good. It was like a lot of other Middle Eastern fare.
Okay.
If I'm perfectly honest, it was good, but not as good as its neighbors. I found it to be a lot more oily, salty, and bland than Persian, Arabic, or Turkish cuisines that were similar.
Yeah.
I did have a few favorites. One of my favorites that is specifically Kurdish, really was hard to find a lot of other places in the Middle East, is a dish called, locally in Suran, it's called kifta, which I know sounds like kufta, which is a different Arabic dish, but kifta is, it's kind of a dumpling, really. It's lamb with usually almonds and sultanas or raisins and spices that were packed into this rice dumpling shell and boiled in a chickpea broth. And it's delicious. It's one of my favorites. I actually learned how to make it myself, and it's very labor intensive, but it is worth the while. It's one of my favorite dishes. Sarupe, or pacha, is another famous one. It's basically the Kurdish equivalent of haggis. It's all the parts of the animal that you generally don't want to eat, boiled in the stomach with spices. And again, surprisingly delightful, delicious. It's what a lot of people would drink after a drunken night out. Or you eat after a drunken night out. You go and get some sarupe at 2 a.m. and eat the lamb's intestines. But some nice culinary delights. Actually, it's a lot tastier than it sounds.
Hey, just a quick one. I just want to say there are many ways to support this podcast. You can buy me a coffee and help support the podcast with $5. Or you can go to my merch store with the affiliate link with TeePublic, where there's plenty of merch available to buy, such as t-shirts, jumpers, hoodies, and also some children's clothing. Thirdly, which is free, you can also rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or Good Pods. Also, you can find me on social media on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Simply just search for Winging It Travel Podcast, and you'll find me displaying all my social media content for travelling, podcast, and other stuff. Thank you.
And is Kurdish culture a lot of outdoors? You know, like meeting friends at a market or a shisha place or a coffee place? Like, is it much like that?
Very much so, yeah. The catchphrase, really, the tagline for Kurds is they have no friends but the mountains. And it's a little bit of a woe is me victim statement in terms of their geopolitical situation, not having their own land, and they're kind of trapped in the mountain region there. But it's also very much of a celebration of their love for the outdoors. Friday is the day off, and everyone goes for a picnic. You drive out in the countryside with your friends, up in the mountains, find some spot picturesque spot by a river, and spend all day just eating and smoking shisha, drinking tea, hanging out, laughing. If you're on a weeknight someplace, you go down to the main street and sit in the tea shops until 2 a.m.
Love it.
Just eating baklava and drinking tea. I mean, and copious amounts of tea, of course.
Baklava as well. Oh
yeah.
That's probably my favorite thing I discovered last year on my Middle East tour was baklava, especially in Turkey. That was unrivaled.
Yeah. Oh goodness. Yeah. I could eat that before, until I'm sick, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. But really it's a very sociable culture. It is very group oriented. It's very communal society. As a focus, which I think can be jarring if you're from a Western European, North American individualist society. It takes a little bit of getting used to. And if you're a natural born introvert, as I am, I know I don't come across as an introvert, I know, but
same
naturally,
I'm naturally, yeah.
So I think that sort of is jarring, and when you find yourself in a communal environment, when you sort of tell your friends, I want to be alone. There's a sort of question mark. Well, what does that mean? But it's delightful because in that kind of context, when you are trying to establish yourself in a society, and you are trying to find a place to be known, to call home, communal societies are really a great antidote to that loneliness, because it sort of fast tracks you towards community and finding that place to really settle in. So I think that's part of what made me stay for so long, was I was so quickly adopted and accepted and incorporated that it made it really hard to leave, actually, because it was like, these are my family now. This is my home. I'm known in this place, and to go anywhere else is a sense of loss. It's grief. So
that's so interesting, isn't it? Because if you base Iraq on history, I'm not just talking about the Americans, the British recently. I think Kurdistan might be different. I'm not sure. I'm obviously not an expert, but British 100 years ago, being there in Iraq and all the other countries, I still find it incredible that after all the stuff that's been done, that they would still welcome you into their culture and into the city based on what has gone on previously. I can't get my head around it.
It is really a puzzling situation, because you would think that there would be a lot of animosity towards Western influence. And there is animosity towards Western military and political influence.
Yeah.
But in terms of, individuals and culture, and, I find the Middle East in general, not just Iraq, but a lot of the Middle Eastern countries do a really good job of just raising individuals who understand the difference between people and politics.
Yes.
And so there's an ability to be friends with the people, but to disagree with the politics, which is a lesson I feel North Americans really need to learn. We've conflated those two, and now if you don't vote the way I do, I don't ever want to speak to you. In North America, the political landscape here is just so rife with animosity. And while there's no shortage of animosity on the political landscape in the Middle East, there's just somehow a different tolerance, different understanding that people and politics are separate.
Yeah.
And that people might make politics, but they are not their politics, and that there's more to them than just their political leanings and who they voted for. And so I think that makes a lot of difference in terms of being able to develop those relationships and to be embedded in the community and be accepted, regardless of your country of origin. And I think just being the underdog in conflict for so long, they're excited to have the rest of the world interested in them now
Of
in a
course.
positive
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Yeah. And interestingly, here's like an interesting anecdote, really, is my local football team in the UK is Ipswich Town, right? And we just signed
Yeah.
an Iraqi footballer. He's called Al Hamadi. And he's
All
actually
right.
born in Iraq, but he moved quite young. So he's got a Scouse Liverpool accent, but his parents
Oh,
obviously
wow.
emigrated to
Yeah.
Liverpool. He obviously can speak Arabic
Mhm.
because he's got Iraqi parents, but obviously he's got that Scouse English accent as well. But we
Yeah.
are now inundated with Iraqi football fans because they see him as like the almost one of the best players they've got, and now he's on
Yeah.
the cusp of going to the Premier League. So I think all the posts he scored the other week, like you're now like our team in Iraq, and there's like all this like amazing comments coming through because they've got this guy who's kind of representing them in a social thing like
Yeah.
football, which is quite cool.
Yeah. It's a hero mentality, really. It's
Yeah,
like, here's a national hero for us,
yeah,
who's done something to put a positive image on what's been a tarnished reputation for so long.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's quite nice to see and hear, I think.
Yeah.
And to finish on Iraq, you had to get evacuated. So what's that about?
Oof, this is a hard one, actually. It's fresh, actually. I was evacuated out. I was asked to leave by the US State Department in late October, so it's only been a few
Oh,
months at this point.
recent. Yeah, yeah.
I will never really know the full story, I'm afraid. But my suspicion is from what I've been able to piece together based on phone calls with the State Department and the FBI, which are statements I never thought I'd have to say out loud. But
Yeah.
is I had made enough of a name for myself locally that it had, raised suspicion and the discomfort of people who didn't want Americans in Iraq, and it had just put me on their radar. And so
Right.
in early October, when Israel-Gaza broke out,
Yeah.
obviously there was a lot of ripple-on effect across the Middle East in terms of the tensions there. And in late October, then I was phoned directly from the consulate in Iraq there, telling me that there was a very credible, viable threat against my safety in the country, and that it was to my best interest to leave as quickly as possible.
Oh, wow.
So that was so a Thursday night I was partying with friends. Friday night I had come home and I received that phone call, and Saturday night I was on the airplane.
God, no messing about.
So yeah, packed everything I could in 2 suitcases, left everything else behind, and left my home, left my job, left my community of 7 years, with the instruction that I would probably never be able to return.
Have they asked questions remotely? Or are you not even allowed to do that?
So I have, you know, made as much known publicly as I could to my workplace and my friends and my community back there. And from what I can piece together, there are only a few, a handful, can count on one hand, the number of other American expats that were asked to leave in the same manner. There are scores more who are still present, who were not asked to leave.
Oh.
And from what I gather, I had released my book in early March. I went on a little bit of a speaking tour, had a strong social media push, went down into Baghdad, gave some the equivalent of TED Talks kind of in and around different parts of the country, developed a social media following, and at the same time was in and out of a number of checkpoints that were run by different militia groups. So, my presence was known as my passport was shown in and out of different checkpoints through the country, with a growing social media presence, with a leadership role in a very well-known private international school run by one of the wealthiest, men in Iraq, who had his own political allegiances.
Sure.
And I think just that sort of perfect storm of different elements was enough to put me just a notch above every other American expat in the region, that I was thrown onto the radar of some not so good folks that didn't want Americans in the country.
Okay.
And I think it doesn't help that, in my book, I talk a lot about the refugee situation, and share a lot of stories there. But I also share a lot about my own personal spirituality and sexuality, which don't jive well with the larger cultural, themes there. So I think all of those things combined really just sort of caught onto the radar, and the U.S. State Department then caught wind of this threat. For whatever intelligence they have, I'm thankful that they have that intelligence, and I'm thankful that they called me. And I basically left in 24 hours, and I'm now back here in the States, back where I was born and raised, and kind of figuring out some new steps in a new direction of what that might look like. But it was a very dramatic, grief-filled departure. I'm not gonna lie. It was it took a fair bit of counseling, and I'm still in that process, to be honest. I'm still processing a lot of what that means to have lost a life that I loved. But also excited for the new chapter what might be ahead. So, and I've said to people, in terms of, emergency landings, this has been the safest one possible. Like, I'm back here with my parents in a home culture, walked right back into a, part-time job that I'd had for a summer a couple of years ago. Really kind of found myself in a very safe space very quickly. But I'll be damned if it wasn't really dramatic and hard to process, and a lot of tears and a lot of trauma. That's a not so nice note to sort of close that chapter of my life on, but it's where I'm at right now.
But it's a great place to visit.
And I for all of that, I will say, Iraq is a great place to visit, and I know my situation is unique and different,
of course,
from the majority of visitors who go, and I still see people who are visiting now, and I think it's great. If you have the intention of ever going to Iraq, I can connect you. There's a great Facebook group called Iraqi Travelers Cafe. It's run by a dear friend of mine, Diyar Talal, and his buddy Osama Musa. Both of them based in Baghdad are phenomenal individuals with this great organization. Check them out on Facebook, Iraqi Travelers Cafe. If you are intending to visit Iraq in any way, shape, or form, they are the most hospitable, generous, well-informed organization to really help you in and through the country. You will not regret making contact with these people. DR and Osama, if you are listening to this podcast, I love you guys, and I cannot wait to see you again somewhere in the world.
Is a part of it almost even more devastating? This goes back to a previous conversation we had about the refugees that you saw in Greece. Because of the passport privilege, the reality is that you, by the sounds of it, can't go back for various reasons. But the fact that can Iraqis travel on an Iraqi passport that freely to come meet you somewhere, it must be much more difficult for them just from a travel perspective, because we all know passports get ranked and flagged as soon as you go through security. So I guess you're thinking, not only have you lost your friendship group and that life, even seeing the friends there that are like from Iraq or from Kurdistan might be quite difficult in the future, because how are you going to do that?
Yeah. So again, passport index, that's a real thing. Passport privilege is definitely real. And Iraq, sadly, just does not rank high on that list. They're in the bottom tier, really. They're down towards the bottom of that list. But that said, it is not impossible. And I have a number of friends who have traveled to more places than I have on their Iraqi passports. It's actually quite, one friend in particular, Badr Khan, who's got a good Instagram following. I think he's been to 90 plus countries on his Iraqi passport, which is phenomenal.
That's
and
incredible.
He's not the only one. There are others who have followed in his wake. And really, it's not impossible. It is difficult, but it's not impossible. And there's always, access points such as Istanbul or Dubai, or Malaysia even, are fairly relatively easy for Iraqis to travel to. So, there's hope. And there's, with the changing political landscape, there's hope that passport index will improve with time. So
always hope.
It's not set in stone.
Yeah, always hope. And what is potentially next for you? What's in the pipeline? What's in your thoughts?
Yeah, in the pipeline, definitely another book or two. So, I'm looking to write a book probably about 7 years in Iraq. And yeah, that whole exit, story is a
Yeah.
movie in and of itself, it feels at times. And probably a book about the flight attendant lifestyle, I think would just be a fun read.
Hmm.
So, keep an eye out, social media, my website, you'll see things pop
Yeah,
up
yeah.
in terms of what's in the pipeline for writing. And in terms of work, I'm keeping some options open for teaching abroad. That is something that I've loved, and I was able to earn my master's in education through my last
Hmm.
employer. So, would love to continue that. But at the moment, um, I have space here in the States with aging parents and nieces and nephews that are growing up, and I'd
Hmm.
love to be a part of their lives, and I'd also love to be able to share a lot of my wisdom that I've learned, this sort of cross-cultural empathic understanding, that there is so much that ties us together, and if we're able to identify some of those universals and to approach others with that empathic sensitivity, we really can create a much stronger, more incorporated, beautiful world. And so I'd love to take my education experience and my cross-cultural experience and actually bring that to uh, the States, which, to the schools here, and go into schools and give talks about cultural awareness and travel talks about different countries around the world, and bring that awareness to help people really understand that there's a great big world out there, and it's to your benefit to have some curiosity and some understanding and some empathy, and that people who are different from you on the surface really aren't all that scary. That you can end up with
Yeah.
some great, dear relationships and close friends, and it'll change your life. It'll change your world for the better if you can approach that way. So I'm looking to some public speaking and some opportunities to really get that message out to the local public schools here and local organizations, and develop that for a short stint at least. So that's the that's the next chapter.
There's one thing going to another country to learn the culture, be in it. There's also another thing to come back to maybe where you're from and even spread the message of what you've learned, because that's also key, isn't it? Because not only do we have people who travel and see things, which is
Mhm.
great, there's people who don't travel or are fearful who also probably need a
Yeah.
bit of encouragement and a bit of knowledge transferred to them about the Iraqis that you've met. Also the Greek scenario as well, which you wrote in your book. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that is pretty key to spread around.
Yeah, there's a lot of global issues that are out there that I think it's just worth bringing to people's attention. And, you know, for all of us that are living that nomadic lifestyle and being around the world, it's great to gather these experiences, but then what do you do with it? How do you
Yeah.
share it with the rest of the world?
Mm.
And, for those who are YouTubers or vloggers or, that are out there, sharing their message, or tour guides or travel coordinators, those are all great things. And I love that there are people doing that. But there are also people that, are too nervous to travel,
Yeah.
or, can't afford to go anywhere else, or really don't have the even cultural understanding or know where to look for the YouTube vlog, or aren't interested in seeing the travel diary. They'd rather have it come, straight to their doorstep, or,
Mm.
have a different package for that. And so I think getting into the education system as well, pairing that with my background and helping students sort of gain that curiosity, I think is really a great opportunity. I'll sort of close out with a story. I
Yeah.
think we've gone a long time here on this one. So you talked earlier on about what was my motivation to really travel, and I really have to give credit to a man named Randy Nadler, who, when I was in primary school, he would come every year and do exactly what I'm dreaming of doing. He would come into the school and give a travel presentation of one particular country where he'd travel to over the summer. And he had an old slide carousel, the old school
Oh yeah.
slides, with
Old
the
school.
ka-chunk on the projector screen.
Yeah.
And we would all sit on these little carpet squares in the school gymnasium as, primary school kids, and for school assembly, and listen to him talk about these other places. And every year he would end his slideshow with a picture of a sunset, except for the one year that really sticks in my memory, when he went to India. and he showed a slide of this architectural element that was really kind of ambiguous. It was hard to decipher what this was from the photo. And he asked what this, the assembly, what we thought it was, and people took guesses. Is it a bridge? Is it a skyscraper? Is it a house? Whatever. And finally, he said, well, it's the world's largest sundial. So instead of a sunset, I'm going to show you a sundial in Jaipur, India.
Oh, yeah.
It's part of this giant astronomical observatory. And, this is how I'm going to end the slideshow this year. And I remember just being fascinated by this. And he would come every year and give these shows. And it was just, kind of piqued my curiosity. Well, several decades went by and I forgot the name Randy Nadler, forgot, any of this until 2018, when I'm traveling in India with my housemate, and we stop at this palace in Jaipur. And we're kind of on a limited time frame. I don't really have a lot of time, and my housemate's feeling a little bit ill, so she didn't really want to go in. So I said, "Oh, I'll go in and kind of do the quick touristy thing and take a few photos. And just, we'll move on to the next destination." So I paid my entry fee and go into this giant garden, and immediately see this observatory right in front of me, in the flesh, for real. And it was thrown back to 30 years prior to my childhood and Randy Nadler in these presentations, and suddenly realized that the reason that I'm anywhere in the world is because of someone like Randy, who would show up and pique that curiosity in students around, around the area. And I went back to the hotel that night and Googled him, found him on the internet, and sent me an email. And I said, thank you so much, because without your inspiration, I would have not spent the last 30 years traveling the world, exploring, living on 4 different continents, learning different languages, and gaining this global experience. And it's thanks to you that I've been able to do that. So, Randy, if you're listening, shout out to you. And I am glad to follow in your footsteps wherever I can.
It's amazing how people do have that impact. Yeah. And it could be all different types of people in your life, not just someone coming to school, could be someone you meet in a cafe, whatever. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Well, your memoir, As Large as Your Spirit, is going to elaborate a lot of what we talked about today. Obviously, that is just the Greek portion. You've got your probably Iraqi book coming out in the future, and imagine. Where can people find you, your website, social media, and also find that book to read? Or listen.
So the book's available on Amazon globally. So you can just search As Large as Your Spirit, Joel David Bond. And I'm available on the web at joeldavidbond.com, and all social media handles the same, Joel David Bond. So Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, those are my key ones there. So you can find me, and there I am.
I'm going to quickly finish with some quick fire travel questions. These are the first thing that comes to your mind. We don't even touch about your year trip that you mentioned earlier, which is incredible. So I'm going to kick off.
Go for it.
It's travel question time.
Your total number of countries that you traveled to?
Oh, gosh. Stopped counting somewhere in the 80s. I think it's probably 85, might be 90 at this point. There's a point when I stopped counting because it wasn't worth it anymore.
Okay, just give a bit of perspective for people listening where you've been. So 3 countries out of that, where tomorrow, if you told someone you got to go to these 3, where are you going to say?
Like you hand me a plane ticket and it's like all expenses paid, like just go.
From places you've been to, top 3.
Let's see. First one comes to mind, Guatemala.
Okay.
Loved Guatemala. Beautiful scenery. Second one comes to mind, probably because I'm still mourning and in grief. If I could, Iraq.
Of course.
Man, I just love it. Third, Iceland, maybe.
Oh yeah, great shout.
Yeah. Iceland, beautiful.
Yeah, big fan. Okay. Next question is 3 countries you've not been to that are next on your hit list if you can go tomorrow.
Peru. Yeah. Would love to go to Peru, Lima, Machu Picchu. South American continent in general is I haven't explored as much as I would love. So definitely down to Peru. Sub-Saharan Africa, have I not been? Namibia. I think I would love to go to the Kalahari Desert. Is it I think it's the San people. I can't say it's a click. I can't even pronounce it. My housemate was from South Africa. She could do the click language, but Namibia I think would be fascinating. The third one, let's go, New Zealand. I haven't been to New Zealand. Nice. Yeah, I'd love to go down under to I've been to Australia, but I'd love to hop a little further across New Zealand.
Yeah, get a camper van out, drive across it. Yeah. Okay. And what top 3 favorite cuisines you've experienced on your travels?
Oh gosh, Turkish. I love Turkish food.
Yeah,
I could eat that till I grow obese and die. Um, it's so good. Indian food,
of course.
you
Yeah.
know, the spicier the better. It's not worth eating if it doesn't make you sweat. Um, I just love it. And you know, I have adopted. Well, I didn't love everything that I had. I loved Guatemalan breakfast, and that has
Okay.
become my Saturday morning treat. Is I will make a Guatemalan breakfast of black beans and a poached egg, or a fried egg. I might do some hash browns, some potatoes
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah.
But it's the Guatemalan black beans and a corn tortilla. Oh my goodness, yeah.
God, wow.
That's my Saturday breakfast. Love it.
Okay. If tomorrow you could go and live in a country for a year that you've not lived in before, where are you going to live?
Can I give you a few? The
Yeah, of
first,
course.
the ones that jump right into my head right now, just quick
Yeah.
fire: Brazil, Morocco, Oman, Singapore. Those are the
Oh,
top four that just jumped in my head.
okay. All quite hot places. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. And what about if you could go to any city for an afternoon with a cup of coffee or wine or whatever you want to drink and just watch the world go by for an afternoon? Where are you going to sit?
You know, the stereotype is Paris.
Of course.
That's, you know, sit in a Parisian cafe and watch the world go by. You know, that's actually a really fascinating question. That's kind of my own personal tradition. Every time I leave a place that I've spent a significant amount of time in, is my last evening, I like to go and sit in the busiest part of town by myself and
Mm,
people watch. I'm not a big party person. I don't sort of go out with the crowd my last night. I tend to try and find a spot and sit and watch the world go by myself, no matter which city I'm in. So,
interesting. Yeah.
you know, the stereotype: Paris, Istanbul, love to
Yeah.
people watch there,
Yeah.
and probably Rio de Janeiro.
Oh, yeah. God, dream.
Yeah,
Okay. Is there anywhere you've been to on your travels that you didn't like?
yes. Do I need to elaborate?
That would be cool. Yeah. You have to give a reason, but it's a quite an
Yeah,
interesting question because we're always positive on this
yeah.
podcast about travel, but sometimes there's got to be a place you don't like. Mine's Bali. I'm interested to see what
Oh
yours
wow.
is.
Okay, yeah. Mine was the Maldives. Um,
Oh wow,
yeah,
I'm
really,
down.
really just you know, and I don't want to give it a good rap because I know people have a great time there, and I probably could also have a good time if I decided to go back.
Hmm.
But I just found, you know, if you wanted, you know, beautiful beaches and warm climate, there were a lot of other cheaper, more affordable, just as beautiful places that you could go. And I don't know, just didn't find the experience personally to be all that great.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Interesting. Okay, got 2 more questions left.
Mhm.
Would you prefer to see a sunrise or a sunset?
I'm a morning person in general. I'm not a night owl, so I'd probably say sunrise, even though I see far more sunsets in my daily life.
Yeah, fair enough. And the last question is going to be just a couple of sentences as to why someone should travel and get out of their comfort zone.
Oh gosh. You know, empathy, seeing the world from another perspective. You know, travel, of course, you know, I mean, it's all the cliches, you know, it makes you a richer person, it makes you,
Mm,
you know, gives you perspectives on the world, you know. But in many ways it really does. If you have the emotional intelligence and the resilience within you, because you have to have an element of that already, I believe, to
mhm.
really make travel profitable on that level. Um, but you know, if you have that emotional resilience and intelligence to go and immerse yourself and put yourself outside your comfort zone and to see the world from another perspective, you will walk away with much greater empathic understanding of the human condition, and see so many more nuances about what it means to be a human being, and open up so many more opportunities for you to connect across a much broader spectrum of the human race than your own sort of immediate, you know, us four and no more neighborhood. So yeah, get out your door, go approach someone with a good smile, fumble up the language and try as hard as you can. Be willing to try the sheep's intestines or whatever else, you know, comes your way, and see that other perspectives are just as valid. And yeah, you'll learn a
Ooh,
lot.
awesome. Joel, thanks for coming onto the podcast. I'll tell you one thing in my mind right now about this podcast episode is there's so much more to discuss that you've been through. Sometimes you can get to some conversations, right, where it's generally the end. There's a few more things, but on this episode, I'm like, there's the year trip. There's even more in Iraq and Greece and all the countries you traveled to on that year trip. I don't even know where to start on another conversation.
You're going to have a hell of a time editing this one.
No, I do go long format because I like the idea of getting to know someone. But yeah, my final thoughts is there could be so many more episodes about all the other stuff you've done. So thanks for coming on and sharing a bit of your story. I think it's going to be super inspirational. I hope, anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been absolutely delightful. I've loved sharing, and I wish I had the time to ask you all these same questions.
Another time.
Another time, indeed.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been absolutely delightful.
Cheers, dude. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to my Winging It Travel podcast episode today. You can find me on Instagram at James Hammond Travel or Winging It Travel Podcast. You can search for both. I release weekly clips of this podcast episode, as well as photos from the last 8 to 10 years of my travels. You can also follow me on TikTok, Facebook and Pinterest by searching Winging It Travel Podcast. I do release daily content to do with travel and the podcast throughout the week. Also check out my website, jameshammond.org. There's content about myself, my travels, and there's also a newsletter sign up as well as a contact form. Finally, please rate and review the podcast on Podchaser. This is my platform of choice. Alternatively, you can rate this on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts from. This really helps the podcast gain a bit of traction for the future in terms of guests and content. And I'm glad to see that you guys are listening out there, reviewing it and enjoying the content so far. Stay safe, stay humble, keep listening, keep traveling, and I'll catch you soon. Cheers, James.